History at Prairie View A&M University.
Thanks, James. Hi, everybody. I know it's the end of the day and you're tired, but hello, hi. I hope that before you entered this auditorium, you had a chance to view the posters in the foyer. There is one aspect of African American scholarly productivity that people have remarked over the years. And that is, by and large, that production has been slim. And one of the remarkable things about the career of our distinguished guest is the high level of productivity associated with her scholarly career. We're going to talk about a number of aspects of her career, but that is to be noted, Nell. Incredible, and no doubt one of the reasons for your fame as a historian is the fact that you've produced so many stellar works. So first, let me begin by saying congratulations on your storied career as a scholar, as a historian. To have written and researched so commandingly about unique aspects of African American history earns you a place in history. Whether the magisterial, forgive me for using that for my favorite book, the magisterial Standing at Armageddon, Exodusters, which I think was your first big book.
My first book, period.
But it was also big. Or Sojourner Truth. You have left us with a deeper understanding of historical eras, places, and figures. So let me ask you, of all the research you have amassed over a career, what was your favorite project?
Ooh, that's so hard. You know, it's always tempting to say it's the most recent one, but I think it was really the narrative of Hosea Hudson, his life as a Negro communist in the South. An unexpected life of a steel worker in Birmingham, Alabama, joined the Communist Party in 1931.
How brave that would have been.
Very, very. Learned to read and write in the Communist Party of the United States, and died in 1988, at 90, still a communist. He was a person of extraordinary strength, physical strength, mental strength, emotional strength. And he was kind of like a grandfather for me. I didn't know, I only met my father's father in Spring, Texas, once. And my mother's father died before my mother came to Prairie View, and then later met my father at what became Southern University in Houston. So he was kind of like a grandfather to me, but he was a radical. And my first book came out from Alfred A. Knopf. It was a really big deal. And very often in book contracts, there's a right of first refusal for the next book. So when I was getting ready to contract the next book, I took Hosea Hudson with me to my publisher's office in the Upper East Side of New York, and introduced him to my editor. And Hosea Hudson then, well, he actually lectured my editor about how if my editor was a Democrat, it was the same as being a Republican, because the only way to oppose capitalism in the United States was to be a communist. They didn't publish it. But he was so gutsy.
Yeah. Who ultimately published it?
Harvard University Press.
Okay.
We landed on our feet.
It was okay.
We landed on it.
That's interesting to note. The research for that project then must have been very interesting in the South,
Yes.
where communism would have had a special place, let's put it that way. What kind of opposition did you run into when you were doing the research for that book?
I didn't run into opposition. What I ran into was silence. Because Hosea Hudson had to leave Birmingham, had to leave Atlanta during the Cold War, of course. And in those days, and I don't know what it would be like now, the idea that there would be black communists in Birmingham, Alabama seemed impossible. One of the reasons I wanted to get involved with him was I wanted to know about the urban history of the South. At that point, and I think to a certain extent still, when you do Southern history, or you learn Southern history, you read Southern history, you read about the rural. And I wanted to know about the urban. So that's how I got involved with him. He happened to be a communist. That was okay. That was interesting too. But he was urban. And I did learn that, but I had to learn it bit by bit. The most interesting thing was that someone who was still a communist, he didn't want me to mention the names of people who had been communists and who had quit. I mean, that was like apathy.
Well, it was dangerous for them.
No, it was like being cast out of the church. And so if you know my book, at various places you'll see footnotes where Hosea Hudson objects to what I'm writing because I'm writing about an ex-communist. So there's a discussion going on in the text and in the footnotes between me and him about what can be said. For him, it had to be a story, an acceptable story for someone who was a communist. For me, his communism was sort of beside the point. I wanted to know about urban history in the South. And if somebody had left the Communist Party, I didn't mind. But he didn't want me to mention that, so we negotiated that through footnotes.
Does anybody who is well-versed in the civil rights movement remember the charges made constantly about communist interference when it came to civil rights demonstrations? I mean, this was a theme in the South. Actually, I would say even today. We hear remarks about things being occasioned by the intrusion of the Communist Party. So it was a big deal for someone like him to be overtly communist.
And he had to leave the South. He had to leave in the late 40s.
And I should say Paul Robeson, of course, was in the North. And look at what happened to Paul Robeson.
And W.E.B. Du Bois both lost their passports during the decade of the 1950s.
So bears remembering. Very special place in our understanding of who we are. It's amazing, isn't it? And to learn who we truly are is to know what transpired in the past, how we came to be who we are. And so I think about somebody like John Hope Franklin, who I know was a mentor to you.
Absolutely.
His standing in our history is immense because he dared to speak of who we are, one of the first to do so.
He did. He published the first, not the first, but the first well-known scholarly history of African Americans in 1947, from slavery to freedom, and then updated it regularly for decades.
Right, truly great person. With the multifarious sources of information in the world today, how do you see the role that traditional historiography and academic historians will play in the future?
Golly, I would hope that well-educated people well-educated Americans, well-educated citizens of the world would want to know more than just sound bites, would want to know how it is we know what we know. And one of the things I think is really important for all of us to understand, whether historians or not, is that the past changes. It's not that there was something that happened, say there was a presidential election in 2008, there was a presidential election in 2016, and that's all we need to know. The meaning of those presidential elections will change over time. And you all are probably, let's see, you were tiny tots in 2008, but you remember Obama, right? So you know how the current moment is trying to revise the Obama era and the Obama presidency. Whether or not that will remain within the historical discussion is another question. But what we are living in, what is around us now, shapes what the questions that we ask of the past. And so those questions change. And so what we need to know, what we want to know about history, changes with time.
So do the current media help us in that regard, in having a truer picture of the past?
I don't know. I'm going to sort of pull away from truer in the sense of once and for all, because I don't think we have a once and for all. The truism is that journalism is the rough draft of history, and there's a lot to that. But what persists as what we know about the past, that changes. I discovered when I did Standing in Armageddon, which is the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was that the academic history that I studied at Harvard really was what the conservatives were saying at the time. So I had to rewrite that history. So that was one good reason for me to want to be a historian, to rewrite the history as I thought it needed to be done.
And that plays an inordinately important role, because people tell our stories however they wish. We ought to be the best at telling our stories. And just as an aside, I was in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in a part of the museum where there's a portrait of Sojourner Truth. Donna Brazil came up to that portrait, and she stood there for the longest time looking at it. And then she, I went up to her, and actually what I was going to do, since she loved it so much, I have a copy of that portrait in my house, I was going to give her that portrait because it moved her so greatly. But I asked her about it, and she then talked about the impact that your book on Sojourner Truth had on her. And as you all know, she is a very important political figure in this country. And she became engaged in this process once she learned more about the version of Sojourner Truth that you revealed to the world. So history can work miracles in that regard.
Can I tell a little bit about that?
Yes.
Okay. So how many of you have heard of Sojourner Truth? Great. How many of you think she said, "Aren't I a woman or ain't I a woman?" This is a miracle. This is the first time I have ever seen an audience like that. So thank you so much. Most of the time I have to go around telling people she didn't say it. A white woman made it up 12 years later. She didn't say it. And people are crushed because they want a sound bite. Thank you.
They prefer that version of the story.
And that's all they want.
Yeah. But at least we ought to know.
Oh,
we ought to know. graduate school.
Yeah, back in the 20th century.
But okay, stop right there. Your development as a scholar must surely have been attributable in large part to your wonderful parents. I always admired your closeness to them and your efforts to include them in what you were doing. Could you just talk about growing up with them and what their support meant to you, and in particular, what sent you on this journey to tell the truth about this history?
I was very fortunate. My parents were Texans. They're both dead now. My mother died at 91 in 2009. My father died that close to 98, days before the presidential election of 2016. So, and I'm an only child, so we grew up together. My father was chief technician of chemistry at the University of California, Berkeley, so I grew up on the Berkeley campus. My mother didn't have a career for a long time, but when she got one, she hired and fired teachers in Oakland, which is where I grew up, Oakland, California. We went to Ghana in the 1960s during Kwame Nkrumah's era to make African socialism. But then there was a coup d'etat and no African socialism, so we came home. But that moment that my parents made possible got me out. I had left the United States before, as you had. Did you do junior year abroad? Something like that.
I did.
Because you were
Fulbright. Fulbright.
Yeah. So we have France in common. I had done junior year abroad before that, but the time in Africa when I was about your age was crucial, and my parents made it possible because I got out of the United States, where even in the Bay Area in California, race seemed like the most important thing you needed to know about anything, including yourself. And in Ghana, I discovered economic issues, questions of development, international questions. It wasn't just Africa, this big blob, but different countries with different histories and different needs and different leadership. So it opened my eyes, and I thank my parents very much for that. As you mentioned, I remained close to my parents through their lifetimes. And to have loving parents is a gift that is irreplaceable.
Well, anybody who loves us, it's a gift.
Especially parents.
But especially people who play the role of parents. And of course, professors often play that role for students.
But also, I was blessed by coming again into contact with the world's smartest, savviest administrator in the world. That was a woman named Ruth Simmons. Who brought me from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to Princeton. So I would not have been at Princeton without Ruth Simmons, so thank you.
Right. Your work as a scholar is, I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. Your work as a scholar is well known, but your work as a mentor to young historians is not as easy to apprehend, and yet I hear about that all the time. Tell us about the role you played in guiding students through their graduate studies.
I'm going to tell you very, very quickly that I talked to Professor Johnson's class this morning, and I said that one of the question was about becoming a teacher and what advice would I give, and I would say, listen and be empathetic, but also up to a point, and then make sure that you can do your own work, because racism and sexism in our society, they're too big for any one person to sort out. But also, I've noticed a pattern in our society when a black woman comes to somebody, and even another black woman, and has something to say, that the automatic response so often is, no, you're wrong. So I always said to my students, listen and kind of nod along, even if you don't agree. You don't have to say you're right, but don't say, no, you're wrong, even if that's the phrase that leaps into your mouth because you're an American. Listen, and then if there's something you can do, find someone who can do that. I was lucky to have a dissertation advisor who taught me things like, if you write a dissertation with a very thin basis of source material, your dissertation is going to look dumb. So make sure that whatever you write about, you have a strong archival basis, that sort of thing. And I passed that on to my students. But promise me, when you come to my funeral, you will not tell everybody what I did for you. Tell them what I wrote. Tell them about what was important in my public life to me. Because it's so easy to talk about women, especially Black women, as helpmeets, as people people whose simple role in life is doing good for others. So I always said to my Black women historian colleagues, Mammy comes with a sunset clause.
I hate to get personal, but my brothers still talk over me all the time. I could be talking, it's as if I don't have a voice at all. They're constantly interrupting and so on. Yeah, my family doesn't go away.
Yeah, I don't have any brothers.
Tell me about this current effort to retell the story of slavery. Does that surprise you, first of all? And your home institution, Princeton, is going through this process of uncovering ties to slavery.
Yeah.
What do you think of all of this?
Well, I think, some years ago, I was president of the Organization of American Historians, and there was this gifted president of Brown University who started an inquiry into the relationship between that institution and its economic basis, which was partly in the slave trade, the Browns. And actually, the Organization of American Historians gave that president of Brown University an award in recognition for that kind of public use of history. And this would have been 2008, I think. And so that moment started other institutions. Now, there were historians writing books, doing scholarly research about the relationship between the slave trade and slavery and institutions of higher education. But that has come out of that moment at Brown, and then the scholarship and realizing that we have to take another look, or many more looks, at American history.
I want to really turn to your more recent work before we open it up to questions. Your fame as a historian was certainly well established. Indeed, few can point to a scholarly career that reached the heights of yours. And yet, you took on a challenging new direction. How does one decide to do such a thing as you have done? First of all, I would say, when you wrote, what's the name of the book on whiteness?
The history of
white people. That was so startling when you did that, and I think did you say that's your best-selling book?
It is. It's still selling like crazy.
Selling like crazy. You say all you need to do is write something about white people, and
that's what somebody said in the living room. John Whiteman says you finally started write about the white.
That sounds like John Whiteman.
Yeah.
How does one decide to do such a thing, knowing that many will voice skepticism about such a move because of the standing you've already achieved in your field? And by this, I'm talking about Nell's direction, going off and deciding to become an artist, and leaving history in order to do that.
Well, Ruth, I'm going to give you two answers. I'm going to give you the answer I usually give, which is, I wanted to and I could. But I'll dig a little deeper for you. And there was some disappointment. It was easy to leave the historical profession in some ways. And I'm going to tell you one instance of that. So some of you know the history of white people. You know it's a big scholarly book. And you know that when I started it early in this century, I was already a well-established historian. I applied for the American Academy in Berlin. My husband was a Fulbright, and I wanted to go too. And I didn't hear back, and I didn't hear back. You know, you need to hear back so you can tell your administrators in your chair if you're going to be there or not. And finally, I called up a historian who, incidentally, is going to be getting an award for scholarly distinction next to me at the American Historical Association in January. So I called him up and I said, what's going on? And evidently they'd had this big fight and they turned me down. That hurt. And it wasn't the only thing like that. There were several ways, moments along the way, when somebody like me, with my bona fides, should have gotten the fellowship, should have gotten the residency, should have been reviewed. So Sojourner Truth, which you all, bless your hearts, know, was never reviewed in the Women's Review of Books. So it was things like that that made it easy to go do something else. You know, I always say I'm the luckiest person in the world to be able to pursue two of my loves. I feel really fortunate, and I'm very grateful for that. But there was also something else.
Well, the fact that so many African American scholars, so many, face the same kinds of slights is evidence, I think, that we still have a long way to go before we achieve the equality that we need to have in the academy.
Let me say something here.
Please.
Some of you may be my Facebook friends, because I do use Facebook. And there's a hashtag called Cite Black Women because of the widespread habit of not citing the work, the scholarly work of Black women.
You mentioned a comment from a teacher you had at RISD that you describe as, quote, an arrow of condemnation piercing your psyche. Tell us how you dealt with other arrows of condemnation in your career that intended to destroy your self-confidence and your ambition. I think there are some lovely passages in this book. One of the things that shocked me now is, let's say, your language in the book, which is, I think in this instance you were quoting him, maybe.
No, I was quoting me.
You were quoting you. Okay, well, anyway.
Can I tell them what I said?
Sure.
I said, Henry, that's bullshit.
She didn't used to talk like that. So here you are, back in school, determinedly deciding that you're going to define yourself anew in your own way, and you're asserting your artistic perspective and persona. And then you get the news from your instructors that you will never be an artist, no matter what you do.
So, to be fair, it was this one.
Okay, it was
My
what?
printmaking teacher, and I name him, Henry. And Henry was extreme. And Henry said I would never be an artist. I could sell my work, I could have collectors, I could have I thought that's how you defined an artist. I could have all that, but I would never be an artist. So at the moment, at that very moment, I said, Henry, that's bullshit, because it was bullshit. But on the other hand, it did hurt.
I don't think you can say that to your faculty. Just, okay.
I don't recommend it.
Don't recommend
You're not
that.
trying to say no. But at that same moment, it hurt.
Yeah.
And when I was in Seattle talking about my book, I had a wonderful big audience. And a young woman in the questions and answers said, how come you couldn't keep that strength? How come you let it hurt? And I said, well, I can't always be strong.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody applauded.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's true, we can't always be strong. I mean, I feel like I did the right thing by telling Henry exactly what I thought. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It didn't hurt for a long time. It did not. It hurt then. But then I started thinking about identity and what we know about racial identity and gender identity, that these aren't things that you are once and for all. They're identities that you live, that you perform, that you learn, that change over time, and that you're not a black person with your family necessarily in a way that you might be going out on the road in Texas, so it changes. I knew that about race and about gender, and I quickly applied that to the identity of artists, that being an artist is something you perform. You're an artist if you make art, if that's how you spend your time.
Mm-hmm. So just before I go to the audience for questions, upcoming projects and the books that you're working on.
Okay. So old in art school, and I use the word old to provoke you in the way that we used to have to use the word black to provoke you. Because in the olden days, black was a bad word. You couldn't say to somebody, you're black. And now you can't say to somebody, oh, you're old. If people say to me, I'd say, I'm old, I am old. And they'd say, oh no, you're not old, you're older. So that's part of it. So this book came out on Juneteenth. You all know what Juneteenth is. Mm-hmm. And it's now in its 4th printing. Mm-hmm. This is a really big deal. So now my agent says, well, what are you going to do next? So one project, I'm thinking about making artist books, is about Emmett Till and me, 1955, and then with the passage of time and how the memory and the knowledge of Emmett Till and the figure of Emmett Till in American history has changed over time. That's one. But before I do that, I'm going to make an artist book. And here's the working title. The History of White People for Dummies, comma, illustrated by the author.
Wow.
We look forward to seeing those for sure. Has everybody here heard of Emmett Till?
Yes.
Okay, well you say like everybody knows, but a lot of people...
If they know about Sojourner Truth,
yeah, we know about Emmett Till. Okay,
yeah.
All right, we're going to open it up to all of you.
One of the beauties of the movement that you're getting ready to join of African American Studies is that we've had in the last 30 years an incredible outpouring of scholarship. Not only scholarship, of general knowledge and creative works. So it's more than any one person can keep up with. So I would say, what is it you want to know? And then go to your library and ask a reference librarian, AKA Wikipedia. So find out what knowledge you need for the questions you have. There's no free-floating right answer, just as there's no free-floating right answer of what questions you need to ask of history now. It depends on what you want to know. But there's so many answers now that, to questions we couldn't even think to ask 30 years ago. The level of what we know. And this is why African American studies is so important, because of the depth of scholarship. You can't just go one weekend and learn about African American studies or African American history or African American theater or African American art. And those different fields are so intertwined that to get a robust knowledge, you really need a place that is interdisciplinary.
And one of the exciting things, I think, for all of us at Prairie View is this path we're on to discover what it should be here. You know, when we think about the fact that in Germany, in Japan, in China, all over the world, people are studying Afro-American studies. It's a phenomenal thing. How impoverished we would be here in the face of that, not to be studying ourselves when the rest of the world is doing it.
Yeah.
So we're very pleased to have you.
Wait, I want to say something
Okay.
about that, though, about African American studies. So much of what is African American studies is American studies. So much of what we consider African American history is American history. So the field is a rich repository of knowledge about American culture, American society, American history, American music, American theater. So the field is a resource for remaking what you can see now people are hungry for a new understanding of what the United States as a society needs. And we have those answers. And it's not, I mean, to know about Black people is important, but it's not all there is in African American studies.